الديمقراطية المباشرة، الديمقراطية العددية، الديمقراطية التوافقية، الديمقراطية التمثيلية، والديمقراطية الامريكية. تعددت الصفات وتنوعت التطبيقات، ولكن السؤال يبقى: هل ما زالت كلمة الديمقراطية تحمل تأويلا إيجابيا وتبصر النور اليوم؟ في زمن الصراعات المتشعبة نقارب الديمقراطية وثقافة السلام من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. نزاعات أثنية وقومية متأججة في 9 مدن كانت محور بحث امتد 17 عاماً لأستاذ السياسات والتخطيط المدني في جامعة كاليفورنيا إيرفاين، الأستاذ سكوت بولنز الذي حاور أكثر من 240 خبيراً في التنظيم المدني وقادة سياسيين وممثلي الأحزاب والأفراد والأكاديميين في القدس المحتلة وبيروت وجوهانسبرغ وبلفاست وموستر وسراييفو في البوسنة والباسك وبرشلونة في إسبانيا ونيقوسيا. جمع صفوة هذه المقابلات في كتابه الأخير المدينة والروح في المجتمعات المنقسمة. المؤلف يكشف كيفية تعايش وعمل المواطنين في هذه المدن الممزقة عرقياً ودينياً وأثنياً وطبقياً، بل وحتى تاريخياً. لعل السؤال الأبرز الذي يطرحه الأستاذ بولنز في مقاربته في هذه المدن هو: ما دور التخطيط المدني والسياسة العامة وتأثيرهما في ظل نزاع متجذر بين الجماعات؟ أما الديمقراطية وماهيتها وأين تطبق والمقاربات المختلفة لمفهومها، وهل يختلف تعريفها باختلاف الزمان والمكان؟ وماذا عن ثقافة بناء الجدران وإعادة بناء ما هدمته الحرب وما هدمه العدو؟ أسئلة أخرى نناقشها مع الخبير في استراتيجيات التطور والإثنيات سكوت بولنز. Professor Scott Bowlens, welcome to the Inside.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. Well, some researchers believe that historic and present-day references to all the different types of the democratic systems tell us that no matter which period of time we are in and no matter which country it is, there has always been a kind of different practice and approach and way of understanding the term democracy. How do you define democracy?
Democracy expresses the will of the people, but you're exactly right. A democracy in one country is going to look and feel differently than a democracy in another country. There's not a one-size-fits-all democracy. There's no formula to it. The development of democracy and democratization is a very messy process. It's very uncertain. It's subject to regressions, fits and starts, and in my opinion, it has to only be developed indigenously within the country itself through action of the people. It can be supported from outside the country, but it's the action of the people within the country that has to propel that country to a democracy that fits that country's characteristics.
How do you mean by, what do you mean by it can be supported from outside the country?
Supported outside the country by other countries supporting actions that's funding and technical assistance that helps people express their will, and that can sometimes
Is it the way you mean the U.S. is supporting the so-called democracy, let's say, in Israel, and they consider it a democratic state?
No, not at all. That's not at all what I'm expressing. For instance, in Egypt, trying to support the will of the people there to now to form the democracy that they want, that best fits the complex conditions of that country. But by support, I don't mean the imposing a democracy, bringing in a formula, bringing in something from the outside, saying it's democracy and fitting it on top of a country that might not have a democratic tradition, that has characteristics much different than Western democracies, for instance, the United States in particular.
You say that you are not a full advocate of democratization. Why?
I'm an advocate of democratization. I think democracy is a worthy goal, the expression of the will of the people rather than a single leader. I support democratization. I don't support democratization that has a very simple definition of what democracy is. I support democratization knowing and acknowledging that it's a very messy, uncertain process that has to fit the conditions of that country that's democratizing, not the dreams and the will of another country such as the United States.
So, do you think that democracy is the prototype to ascertain justice among people?
I think it's a worthy goal. I'm not. But with the understanding that democracy is going to look much different in one country compared to another. A country with deep intergroup divisions will have a democracy that is going to be much different than a country that's more consensual and has a more homogeneous population. We can call both of those democracies, but they're going to act very much different from each other.
How far can money, let's say, arms and media and other aspects affect democracy?
Unfortunately, well, it can affect it in a negative way, the democratization process.
So is it going to turn it upside down into another kind of democracy?
Yeah, funding and media can distort the process. And often, if it's a Western media, it will portray a process that actually is progressing, but in Western minds, it's not. And Western media will be very critical of the process. The democratization process in the United States was a very messy affair. It involved a long war. It was not a pretty thing. It was not a simple climbing of a single mountain. It was navigating a long mountain range with lots of uncertain peaks, lots of unexpected terrain. It's a difficult, long process that the world, other countries, and especially the country going through democratization, has to be very patient with, very patient.
Usually, everyone aspires to the fact that democracy would come after the toppling of an authoritarian, a dictatorship, authoritarian regime. So which one comes first?
It would have to be the toppling, but the problem with that, the expectation that with the toppling of an authoritarian regime we have democracy is, that's a falsehood. It does not happen that way. The after effects, the hangover of an authoritarian regime are long and will take a long time to work itself out. There's legacies of the powerful cadre of people, whether it's military or otherwise, that surrounded themselves around that single leader, and they're not just going to disappear into the night and let democratic activists have the reins of government. It's going to take a long, long time.
Dr. Bولنز, there are certain countries that have multi-ethnic, multicultural, even multilingual societies. Here, in this sense, do we have the same criterion of democracy?
It is moderated. Democracy still seeks to express the will of the people, but where we have such identifiable groups with their own group interests, we have to moderate that direct majoritarian democracy so that each of those groups' rights are respected and acknowledged, so that no one group interest can just be ridden over and erased by another group. We have to acknowledge each of those groups' interests. That is very hard with a democratic system. Democracies that respect each group tend to be in gridlock. They tend to have a very hard time moving forward with progressive policies. But I would rather have that type of system than one group dominating another in the name of democracy.
Well, Dr. Bولنز, you studied like 9 cities in 7 different countries, and you've written about that in your most recently published book, City and Soul in Divided Societies, where you told the story of inflammatory, nationalistic, and ethnic conflict across these cities. How do you compare across conflicts?
It's very difficult to compare across conflicts. I am an urban planning professor. I study cities, so one of my main ways of looking at conflict is based on the city. What happens in the city and what policies are taken in a city and how that affects either positively or negatively the broader nationalistic conflict. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is a nationalistic conflict, among other things, but also there's the focus on Jerusalem as a focal point, a city that introduces an additional complexity. So I focus on cities and what role they play in the conflicts and what role policymakers can play in those conflicts. Back to your question, I put these conflicts along a continuum from conflicts that I would say are active conflict. There's no resolution of the broader nationalistic conflict.
Like Jerusalem.
Israel, Palestine, and Jerusalem. All the way on the other side to cities where peace building has been achieved. There's been some democratization that has allowed at least the root political issues to be solved. South Africa and the case of Spain in terms of the city of Barcelona. I put on those the other extreme. In the middle are these categories, two categories where the city is in a society that is moving toward peace, but it is not a sure bet that they're going to reach peace. They're in the process of peace building. Sometimes some cities, one I studied Mostar in former Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, they have the absence of conflict, but that's about all. There's no
peace.
There's no movement toward
peace.
It does not feel like peace.
Why, in your opinion?
They are in gridlock. The two antagonistic parties, the Croats, the Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Muslims, are each holding ground in that city of Mostar, and they're not agreeing to co-govern any aspect of that city. So it's just stuck. The war ended, but they're just stuck. There's no movement, there's no negotiation, there's no compromise in Mostar.
What about the case of occupied Palestine, Jerusalem?
The most difficult case, a whole set of core root political issues unaddressed, not only unaddressed, but through...
Is it only political issues?
That's the way I frame the categories I use, because then I look at what the role of the city is. Israel-Palestine, a whole set of non-resolution of issues, and then I look at how the various actions Israel has taken to make those issues even harder to resolve. We're going away from any possibility of peace in Jerusalem and Israel-Palestine. We're going in the wrong direction. So a lot of my studies with Jerusalem have looked at settlement and neighborhood construction, restriction on Palestinian growth, the recent separation wall, and just the whole...
Well, actually, we'll talk about the separation wall and the culture of building walls, but we have to stop now for a short break. The Inside will be back after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Inside with our guest from the US of A, Professor Scott Bولنز. Welcome back, Professor Bولنز. Well, we were talking before the break about the separation wall. How can we build, or how can we have a culture of peace when a culture of building walls is still exacerbating, particularly in occupied Jerusalem?
Yes.
And not only in this city, but you know, the Israeli have always shown this passion for building walls, and we have it now with you've been to the south and you've seen how they started building a cement barrier, a big cement barrier in the south, the bordering Lebanon.
Yes. Walls are the worst manifestation of conflict on the ground. And when I study urban areas, the construction of walls, say the wall in Jerusalem, or the walls that still exist to this day in Belfast, Northern Ireland, because of the severe troubles there for decades, or the wall that separates Nicosia, Cyprus into two. It's the worst.
That has been there since 1974.
Exactly. When walls are created, they don't go away. and that's the problem. Walls are physical manifestations of the conflict, and walls say we can no longer get along with the other side. And walls would be bad if they could be built and then 4 or 5 years later they could be dismantled. But walls aren't dismantled. I mean, a wall in Berlin was dismantled, but after so many decades. Walls have a staying power. The separation wall around Jerusalem and Israel-Palestine is going to have a long staying power, I'm afraid. As an urbanist, as someone who wants to create cities that have the potential for peace, what we try to do is avoid divisions at all possible, certainly avoiding the construction of walls, but avoiding the physical construction of divisions of any type. It could be a road that separates one ethnic neighborhood from another, and all of a sudden that road becomes a de facto dividing line. So as urbanists, we try to create maintain a more flexible urban fabric amidst conflict. It's very difficult to do. Flexibility of urban form during conflict doesn't mean that people are going to get along. They're still going to segregate, they're still going to sort during conflict. But once the conflict ends, that flexibility, that porosity in the urban fabric will allow people to normalize over a shorter period of time. If we have an urban area that just segregates and divides and walls itself, it builds in stereotypes, it teaches children about the other side, and it's not good what children learn about the other side when they live in a walled environment. And we're just building in hatred intergenerationally.
Implicitly, through such kind of divisions.
Implicitly, yeah. The divisions become normal.
Where have you realized that this exists and still exists, despite of the fact that some cities have jumped into, let's say, a kind of peace?
Yeah. Best example is Belfast, Northern Ireland. They've had a peace agreement since 1998. But when one walks around Belfast, you see so-called peace walls, these walled divisions that...
Peace walls.
They're called
How
peace
ironic.
walls, yes, that divide Catholic from Protestant neighborhoods. And you talk to people that live around these walls, and they talk about the other side as still their archenemy, the evil other. And yet this is 14 years after so-called peace was achieved. Sometimes, we talked about democracy earlier, sometimes we give a definition to peace that is very simplistic too. We think just because we have a peace agreement, everything's going to be fine tomorrow, and that is a total fallacy.
Well, you've studied those 9 cities. What did your research teach you as an American researcher for the last 16 years studying those cities? Are you planning to do some more?
I'm sure I will. I've been doing this for a while, and it just kind of has a momentum of its own. I don't know where I'll go next. I've learned that cities and urban areas are very important. Very often when people talk about peace, they stay at the national level, and they talk about the handshakes and the negotiations and the diplomats, but they don't pay attention to the urban level, and they don't pay attention to the fact that how neighbors get along is going to determine the quality or even the possibility of peace, and certainly the quality of peace. How formerly antagonistic neighbors get along is going to determine what that quality of peace is like, far more than the handshakes of diplomats in front of cameras. That's nice and that's needed, but it's what happens on the ground, the urban peace building, that's important.
To what extent has intergroup conflict and over, let's say, issues, nationalistic issues, been addressed effectively in these cities?
In the cities? Some cities have addressed them very well. Others, most of the time, it's a struggle. Cities view themselves, city policymakers and so forth, view themselves as subordinate to the national leaders, so they don't feel bold enough to make decisions on their own that might be contrary to national leadership. One city that's a very positive example of of a multinational democracy, if you will, is Barcelona, Spain. We have to remember Spain went through a horrendous time under Franco and a very important transition from Franco to democracy. And I would suggest to you that in Barcelona, that transition worked. And there's a lot of reasons why it did. Barcelona is a very open, vibrant, energetic city which encompasses both sides of the conflict, if you will, the Spanish centralist and the Catalan regionalist.
Allow me now to move on a bit to Beirut. You studied Beirut extensively, and I want you to focus a bit on telling us how have urban planning and urban policy and urban governance change or define the issues, the sectarian issues and conflict in Beirut, in the city of Beirut, since the Civil War.
Yeah. Beirut's a fascinating case, and Beirut's a wonderful, vibrant, robust, chaotic city. For a Westerner to live in Beirut, it's a tremendous opportunity. Urban policy has had a difficult time dealing with the many years of civil war, the physical legacies of the East-West divide. Urban policy making, I would say, has stepped back from addressing issues of sectarianism, and they have not been bold enough. A case in point, opening up public parks again after the war. They've been very hesitant to do that. The very large park in the southern part of Beirut, they've been very hesitant to open up that because they fear that there'll be a mixture of
Who
sex.
they? Who do you mean by they?
The municipal policymakers, who have made an active decision to open up only part of that park, not the whole park, because how it borders different sectarian communities.
Yes.
So they've stayed back from that. Then we have the two extreme examples of trying to reconstruct Beirut. One is Solidaire in the central city, where really the profit motive takes priority. That is I say it's a very extreme example because government has basically removed itself, municipal government and state government, and really has given it over to private developers to reconstruct. The other example is the WAD project in the south suburb.
After the war of 2006.
After the war of
Israeli war
2006, so two different conflicts, of course.
Also, the government removed itself from this
exactly.
project.
And here the WAD project, which I've been studying recently, is a very interesting example because instead of giving it over to private profit, like in Solidaire, in WAD it's an emphasis on actual human and social dimensions of urban living. And the emphasis is on what the non-governmental organization of WAD could do for the residents that were displaced in the southern suburb. I make the distinguishing, I distinguish between what we could call exchange value that dominates Solidaire, the buying and selling of property, making a profit, where use value is what the priority is in the southern suburb. What is the quality of life for people there, and how can that place be reconstructed as it was, so that people could maintain their identity, their memory, their pre-war, pre-2006
This is an asset, actually, just to let the people, you know, to come, because I'm a person whose house was devastated in this area, and it was really something rewarding to come back to the memories that I let.
Yeah. Most definitely. It's a very, I said two extreme examples. I would say the WAD project is a very positive example.
You said actually in your book about Beirut in this chapter that this project is globally unique. In which sense is it unique?
It's globally unique, I would say. Many other cases of reconstruction after war or reconstruction amidst political conflict, there's only partial redevelopment. The government is ambivalent. There's partial redevelopment. There's displacement that is in place 20 years after the conflict. People have been scattered geographically. People are embittered because they can't move back to their homes. That's the traditional, that's kind of the common way that we see reconstruction throughout the world. Another case is where reconstruction is driven by international donors. And the international donors really drive what happens in the reconstruction rather than the city in having a citywide plan. So those other reconstruction cases are partial, kind of incomplete, and have not very positive results, where the WAD case, everyone is back in place with their identity, where they were before, their social connections, and their pre-war memories, and that is extraordinary.
Right, Professor Scott Bowlens from USA, thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
ضيف جديد وموضوع جديد نقاربه دائما من الداخل في الحلقة القادمة. بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net. إذن theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.